The church bells of Dusty Creek rang out across the dusty streets with a clarity that seemed to cut through the oppressive heat of the August afternoon. Every soul in town had gathered for what promised to be the grandest wedding the frontier settlement had ever witnessed. The small wooden church, with its whitewashed walls and simple steeple, had been transformed with ribbons of ivory silk and wildflowers gathered from the surrounding mesa. Even the saloon had closed its doors for the occasion, a testament to the significance of this union between the town's most prominent families. Clara Jennings stood before the cracked mirror in the church's modest preparation room, her reflection wavering in the imperfect glass like a vision from a fever dream. The wedding dress, imported all the way from San Francisco at considerable expense, hung upon her frame with all the weight of expectation her father had placed upon this day. Layers of cream-colored silk and delicate lace cascaded from her waist. The bodice fitted so precisely that each breath felt measured and deliberate. Her dark auburn hair had been pinned and curled by the town's only seamstress, who had fussed over every strand until it resembled the elaborate styles she'd seen in the fashion plates from back east. Yet despite the finery, despite the careful attention to every detail that would mark her as a proper bride, Clara's green eyes held a restlessness that no amount of powder could conceal. Those same eyes had seen things that the other ladies of Dusty Creek could never imagine. The aftermath of shootouts in the saloon, the desperate faces of men caught stealing cattle, the cold calculation in the gaze of a killer. For beneath the layers of silk and propriety lay a secret that would shock every person gathered in that church. Clara Jennings was the town's deputy sheriff, the only law enforcement officer Dusty Creek could claim when Sheriff Morrison was away on territorial business. The irony was not lost on her. Here she stood, dressed as the embodiment of feminine virtue and submission, while hidden beneath her wedding dress lay the cold steel of her grandfather's Colt revolver, strapped to her thigh with a leather holster she had fashioned herself. The weight of the badge, carefully concealed in a pocket sewn into her corset, pressed against her ribs like a constant reminder of who she truly was beneath this elaborate masquerade. "Clara, dear, you look absolutely radiant." Her father's voice broke through her reverie as Mayor Thomas Jennings entered the small room, his considerable bulk filling the doorway. His face, weathered by years under the harsh desert sun, beamed with satisfaction as he surveyed his daughter. "Elias is the luckiest man in the territory. This union will secure our family's position for generations to come." Clara turned from the mirror, forcing her lips into what she hoped resembled a bride's nervous smile. "Yes, Father. I understand the importance of today." The words tasted like dust in her mouth, but they were the ones expected of her. In truth, the importance of this day weighed upon her like a millstone. Marriage to Elias Ward would mean the end of her secret life as a law officer, the end of her independence, and the beginning of a carefully orchestrated existence as the wife of the territory's most successful cattle rancher. Elias Ward owned the largest spread within 100 miles of Dusty Creek, his brand marked on thousands of head of cattle that grazed across the endless grasslands. At 35, he was considered a prime catch, handsome in a conventional way, with neat brown hair and steady gray eyes that spoke of reliability and prosperity. He had courted Clara with all the proper formalities, bringing gifts of jewelry and silk scarves. Speaking of the fine house he would build for her and the children they would raise together. Yet something in his manner had always made Clara's skin crawl, though she could never articulate exactly what. Perhaps it was the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, or the possessive tone he used when speaking of their future together. More troubling were the inconsistencies she had noticed in his business dealings. Sudden wealth that seemed to exceed what even the most successful ranching operation should produce. mysterious visitors who came and went from his property under cover of darkness, and cattle-bearing brands she didn't recognize grazing alongside his own stock. "The guests are getting restless," her father continued, pulling out his pocket watch and frowning at its face. "Reverend Matthews is ready to begin, and Elias has been pacing like a caged animal for the past 20 minutes. Clara nodded, gathering the train of her dress and preparing to face what felt increasingly like her own execution. As they walked toward the church's main doors, she could hear the murmur of voices from the assembled crowd. Through the small window, she caught glimpses of the townspeople, shopkeepers and their wives, ranch hands in their Sunday best, even a few of the working girls from the saloon who had closed up shop to witness the spectacle. The church itself had been transformed for the occasion. Wooden pews that usually held no more than 30 souls on Sunday mornings were packed beyond capacity, with standing room only at the back. Someone had managed to procure actual glass windows from Santa Fe, and the afternoon light streamed through them in golden shafts that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. At the altar, Reverend Matthews stood with his worn Bible, his thin frame draped in his best black coat despite the oppressive heat. And there, waiting beside the altar with his hands clasped behind his back, stood Elias Ward. He cut an impressive figure in his new suit of charcoal wool, his brown hair slicked back with pomade and his gray eyes fixed upon the door through which his bride would emerge. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, the satisfied expression of a man about to claim his prize. Clara felt her father's arm tighten around hers as they prepared to make their entrance. The weight of expectation from the assembled crowd seemed to press down upon her like the heat of the desert sun. Every person in that church knew this marriage represented more than the union of two people. It was the cementing of an alliance between the territory's political and economic powers. Her father, as mayor, controlled the town's civil authority, while Elias commanded the respect that came with wealth and land ownership. "Remember, daughter," her father whispered as they paused at the threshold. "This marriage secures not just your future, but the future of Dusty Creek itself. Elias has promised to invest in new businesses, to bring prosperity to our little town." Clara nodded, though her mind was racing with thoughts that had nothing to do with prosperity or security. In her role as deputy sheriff, she had been investigating a series of strange incidents, mysterious shipments that passed through town in the dead of night, sudden disappearances of travelers on the main road, and whispered rumors of weapons being sold to hostile tribes. Each trail she had tried to follow seemed to lead back to properties owned or controlled by men in Elias Ward's circle. The organ, a battered instrument that had made the journey from St. Louis strapped to the back of a freight wagon, wheezed to life with the opening notes of the wedding march. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of her concealed revolver against her leg, and stepped forward into the suffocating warmth of the packed church. Every eye turned toward her as she began her slow procession down the aisle. She saw faces she had known all her life: Mrs. Patterson from the general store, Doc Williams, who had delivered half the babies in town, even grizzled old Jake Murphy, who ran the livery stable, all of them beaming with the vicarious pleasure of witnessing what they believed to be a fairy tale romance come to life. If only they knew the truth. If only they understood that the woman walking down this aisle in silk and lace had spent the previous week tracking a suspected horse thief through the Badlands, or that she could outdraw most men in the territory. The irony was almost enough to make her laugh, if not for the crushing weight of what this ceremony represented. As she drew closer to the altar, Clara's eyes met those of Elias Ward. His smile broadened, and she saw something in his gaze that made her stomach turn. The look of a man who believed he was about to own something precious. Not love, not partnership, but possession. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she almost stumbled on the train of her dress. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat and opened his Bible, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed crowd. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Clara felt as though she were watching the scene from outside herself, as if her spirit had somehow separated from her body and was observing from the church rafters. The words of the ceremony washed over her like water, meaningless sounds that held no connection to her true self. This was not Clara Jennings, deputy sheriff and protector of justice, standing at this altar. This was merely a costume she wore, a role she played to satisfy the expectations of others. The heat in the church was becoming unbearable. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the powder, and she could feel the silk of her dress beginning to cling uncomfortably to her skin. The assembled crowd seemed to press closer, their expectant faces blurring together in the golden light that streamed through the windows. If any person can show just cause why they may not be joined together, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. The traditional words hung in the stifling air of the church like a challenge, though everyone present knew it was merely a formality. Who would dare object to this union between the town's most powerful families? The silence stretched out, heavy with expectation and the promise of celebration to come. It was in that moment of perfect stillness that Clara heard it, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder with each passing second. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, cutting through the sacred silence like a blade through silk. At first, the assembled congregation exchanged uncertain glances, perhaps thinking it was merely a late arrival or someone passing through town. But the rhythmic pounding against the hard-packed earth spoke of urgency, of a rider pushing his mount to its absolute limits. Clara felt her pulse quicken, her trained instincts as a deputy sheriff immediately alert to the sound of trouble approaching. The weight of her concealed Colt suddenly felt more pronounced against her thigh, and her hand twitched involuntarily toward where the weapon lay hidden beneath layers of silk and lace. Beside her, Elias Ward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gray eyes flickering toward the church doors with an expression that might have been annoyance, or something darker. Reverend Matthews paused in his recitation, his weathered face creasing with concern as the hoofbeats drew nearer. The sound was now so close that the very floorboards of the church seemed to vibrate with each impact. Several of the women in the front pews began to fan themselves more vigorously, while the men shifted restlessly, hands moving instinctively toward where their sidearms would normally rest, though most had left their weapons at home out of respect for the sacred ceremony. "Perhaps we should," the Reverend began, but his words were drowned out by a sound that made every soul in the church freeze with terror. The distinctive crack of a Winchester rifle split the air, followed immediately by the splintering of wood as the church doors exploded inward. Splinters flew like shrapnel, and several women screamed as the peaceful sanctity of the ceremony was shattered beyond repair. Through the ruined doorway, framed against the brilliant desert sunlight, appeared a figure that seemed conjured from the very legends of the frontier. Jace Callahan sat astride a magnificent black stallion, the animal's coat gleaming with sweat and its nostrils flared from the hard ride. The horse danced nervously in the doorway, its iron shoes striking sparks from the stone threshold. Jace himself was a sight to behold, tall and lean, with sun-bleached hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of winter sky. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent his life under the open sky, and a 3-day growth of beard gave him the appearance of a desperado from a dime novel. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, leather chaps over worn denim, a faded blue shirt open at the collar, and a black hat tilted at a rakish angle. But it was the weapons he carried that made the blood of every person in that church run cold. A pair of matched Colt .45s hung low on his hips, their worn grips speaking of frequent use, while the smoking Winchester in his hands left no doubt about his intentions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jace called out, his voice carrying easily over the terrified murmurs of the crowd. "I apologize for the interruption, but I'm afraid this wedding cannot proceed." The congregation erupted into chaos. Women shrieked and clutched at their husbands, while the men shouted in outrage and confusion. Several of the ranch hands who worked for Elias began to reach for weapons that weren't there, their faces flushed with anger and embarrassment. At the back of the church, old Jake Murphy was already edging toward the side door, his survival instincts honed by decades on the frontier. "How dare you!" Mayor Jennings roared, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as he stepped protectively in front of his daughter. "This is a house of God. You have no right." "I have every right," Jace interrupted, his winter blue eyes never leaving Clara's face. There was something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not the predatory hunger she had seen in Elias's eyes, but a desperate intensity that spoke of a man driven by forces beyond mere greed or lust. "Miss Jennings is in great danger, and I cannot allow this marriage to take place." Elias Ward stepped forward, his hand moving toward the dress coat where Clara knew he kept a small derringer. "Callahan," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "You're making a grave mistake. This woman is under my protection, and I will not allow—" "Your protection?" Jace laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's rich, coming from a man who deals in stolen cattle and smuggled weapons. Tell me, Ward, does your bride-to-be know exactly what kind of man she's about to marry?" The accusation hit the church like a thunderclap. Several people gasped, while others murmured in confusion and disbelief. Clara felt her heart skip a beat as pieces of a puzzle she had been working on for months suddenly began to fall into place. The mysterious nighttime shipments, the unbranded cattle, the sudden wealth that seemed to exceed what even the most successful ranching operation should produce. It all made a terrible kind of sense. "You're nothing but a common outlaw," Elias snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Everyone knows you've been rustling cattle and robbing travelers on the territorial road. The territorial marshal has a warrant for your arrest. Is that what you told them?" Jace shook his head, his expression one of grim amusement. "I suppose it was convenient to blame me for your own crimes, but the truth has a way of coming out, doesn't it?" Clara's mind raced as she processed what she was hearing. Jace Callahan was indeed known throughout the territory, but the stories about him were contradictory and confusing. Some said he was a ruthless outlaw who had terrorized the countryside for years. Others claimed he was a former lawman who had turned to vigilante justice after witnessing too much corruption in the territorial government. She had been trying to piece together the truth about him for months, but every lead seemed to vanish like smoke in the desert wind. "Enough of this nonsense," Mayor Jennings declared, his political instincts finally overriding his shock. "Sheriff Morrison is away on territorial business, but we have enough good men here to deal with one outlaw. Boys, take him down." Ugh. Several of the younger men in the congregation began to move forward, their faces grim with determination. But Jace's response was swift and decisive. He fired the Winchester into the air, the sound deafening in the confined space of the church. The advancing men froze as plaster rained down from the ceiling where the bullet had struck. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Jace said, his voice carrying clearly over the ringing in everyone's ears. "But I will if I have to. Miss Jennings, you need to come with me. Your life is in danger." Don't listen to him, Clara, Elias said urgently, his gray eyes fixed on her face. He's obviously deranged. Stay close to me, and I'll protect you. For a moment, Clara stood frozen between the two men, her mind churning with possibilities and implications. Everything about this situation felt wrong, but not in the way it should have. Jace Callahan's dramatic entrance should have terrified her, should have sent her running into the protective arms of her intended husband. Instead, she found herself studying his face, searching for signs of deception or madness and finding neither. What she saw instead was a man driven by desperate purpose, someone who had risked everything to prevent what he believed would be a terrible mistake. The intensity in his winter blue eyes spoke not of criminal intent, but of a fierce determination to protect someone he believed to be in mortal danger. "Miss Jennings," Jace said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I know this is difficult to understand. I know you have no reason to trust me. But if you marry this man, you will be signing your own death warrant. He needs you for more than just your father's political connections. He needs you as a shield against the law that's closing in on him." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. In her work as a deputy sheriff, she had learned to read people, to separate truth from deception. And despite the impossibility of the situation, despite the chaos and confusion surrounding her, she found herself believing him. "Clara, don't be foolish," her father urged, reaching out to grasp her arm. "This man is clearly unstable. He's probably been drinking or—" Clara pulled away from her father's grasp, her green eyes never leaving Jace's face. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Jace reached slowly into his vest pocket, moving deliberately so as not to alarm the nervous crowd. From it, he withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and wear. "Because I have proof," he said, holding up the book. "Names, dates, shipping manifests, payment records, everything you need to know about your intended husband's true business." Elias Ward's face went ashen. "Those are forgeries," he said quickly, but Clara heard the desperation creeping into his voice. "He's trying to frame me for his own crimes." The church had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the nervous shifting of the congregation and the heavy breathing of the black stallion still standing in the doorway. Clara felt as though she stood at the center of a whirlwind, with forces beyond her understanding pulling her in different directions. It was then that her training as a law officer took over. She had spent months investigating the very crimes Jace was now laying at Elias's feet. She had followed countless dead-end trails and encountered suspicious obstacles at every turn. If Jace Callahan really did have evidence, real evidence, then she had a duty to examine it, regardless of the personal cost. "Show me," she said quietly. "Clara, no!" Elias lunged forward, his hand finally closing on the small derringer concealed in his coat, but Clara was faster. Years of practice with her grandfather's Colt had honed her reflexes to a razor's edge. Before anyone could react, she had swept aside the folds of her wedding dress and drawn the hidden revolver, its barrel aimed squarely at Elias's chest. The church erupted in fresh chaos as the assembled crowd realized that the bride they had come to see married was armed and dangerous. Women screamed and men shouted, while children were hastily pushed behind pews for protection. Even Jace Callahan looked stunned by this unexpected development. "Nobody moves," Clara said, her voice cutting through the pandemonium with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Elias, drop the derringer." Slowly. For a moment, Elias hesitated, his gray eyes calculating the odds. But the steady barrel of Clara's Colt never wavered, and he eventually let the small weapon fall to the floor with a metallic clatter. "Good," Clara said, her green eyes still fixed on her intended husband. "Now, Mr. Callahan, if you would be so kind as to dismount and show me this evidence you claim to have." Jace swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, his boots hitting the stone floor with a solid thump. He moved slowly toward the altar, the leather journal held out before him like an offering. The black stallion remained in the doorway, as if standing guard against anyone who might try to interfere. "Before I look at this," Clara said, her weapon still trained on Elias, "I want you to know that I am a deputy sheriff of this territory. If you are trying to deceive me, I will see that you hang for it." Jace's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with something that might have been respect. "A lady lawman," he murmured. "That explains a great deal." He handed her the journal, and Clara flipped it open with her free hand. What she saw there made her blood run cold. Page after page of meticulous records, dates and times of weapon shipments, names of tribal contacts, payment schedules for corrupt officials, and at the center of it all, signed and sealed, were documents bearing the unmistakable signature of Elias Ward. "Dear God," she whispered, her face going pale as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "You've been selling rifles to the Apache, and not just rifles, ammunition, supplies, intelligence about cavalry movements." "Clara, those documents are forgeries," Elias said desperately. "Can't you see what's happening here? He's trying to frame me because I've been getting too close to exposing his own criminal activities." But Clara was no longer listening to her intended husband. She was studying the journal with the trained eye of a law officer, noting the consistency of the handwriting, the authentic look of the official seals, the way the pages showed natural wear and aging. This was no hastily forged evidence. This was a careful record kept over many months, possibly years. "Mr. Callahan," she said finally, closing the journal and looking up at the man who had just shattered her world. "I believe we need to have a much longer conversation, but not here." Without warning, she spun toward him, and before anyone could react, she had grabbed his outstretched hand. "If you're telling the truth," she said quietly, "then my life really is in danger, and if that's the case, I'm going with you." The words were barely out of her mouth when Jace pulled her toward him with surprising gentleness, his strong arm encircling her waist. In one fluid motion, he lifted her onto the saddle behind him, her wedding dress billowing around them like a silk cloud. "Hold tight," he murmured, and spurred the black stallion forward. The great horse leaped through the shattered church doors and into the blazing afternoon sun, carrying with it the most unconventional bride Dusty Creek had ever seen, armed, dangerous, and riding toward an uncertain destiny with a man who might be either her salvation or her doom. The black stallion's hooves thundered against the sun-baked earth as they burst from the church into the blinding afternoon light. Clara pressed herself against Jace's back, her wedding dress streaming behind them like a banner of rebellion against everything she had been expected to become. The horse's powerful muscles bunched and released beneath them as they flew through the dusty streets of Dusty Creek, past startled townspeople who dove for cover at their approach. Behind them, shouts of confusion and anger erupted from the church. Clara could hear her father's voice bellowing commands, Elias Ward's furious curses, and the general chaos of a crowd trying to comprehend what had just transpired. But these sounds quickly faded as Jace urged his mount toward the open desert, leaving the familiar world of her childhood disappearing in a cloud of dust. The sensation of riding at such breakneck speed was both terrifying and exhilarating. Clara had ridden horses all her life. It was an essential skill for anyone living in the territory, but never like this, never with such desperate urgency and purpose. The wind whipped at her carefully arranged hair, pulling pins loose and sending auburn strands flying free. Her elaborate wedding dress, so carefully fitted just hours before, now felt like a cumbersome burden that caught the wind and threatened to unbalance them both. "Where are we going?" she called over the thunder of hoofbeats and rushing wind. "Away from here," Jace replied, his voice tight with concentration as he guided the stallion around a cluster of barrel cacti. "They'll be organizing a pursuit within minutes. Ward has enough men on his payroll to field a small army." They rode hard across the flat desert floor, the horses' hooves kicking up small clouds of alkaline dust that stung their eyes and coated their skin. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering furnace that made the air dance with heat mirages. In the distance, the red rock formations of the Badlands rose like ancient monuments against the pale blue sky. Clara's mind raced as fast as the horse beneath them. Everything she thought she knew about her life had been shattered in the space of a few minutes. The man she had been about to marry was apparently a criminal of the worst sort, a traitor who sold weapons to hostile tribes and endangered the lives of innocent settlers. The stranger who had kidnapped her from her own wedding claimed to have evidence of these crimes, and she herself, the dutiful daughter who had been playing her role so carefully, was now fleeing across the desert with a man whose reputation was as mysterious as it was dangerous. "The canyon," Jace said, pointing toward a narrow cleft in the rock walls ahead. "We can rest there and let the horses recover. They'll have trouble tracking us through the stone." As they approached the canyon entrance, Clara was struck by how well Jace seemed to know this desolate country. He guided the stallion through the narrow opening with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route many times before. The walls rose up on either side of them, providing blessed relief from the punishing sun as they entered a world of cool shadows and echoing silence. The canyon floor was carpeted with sand that muffled the horses' hooves, and a small spring bubbled up from between the rocks to form a clear pool surrounded by hardy desert willows. It was an oasis of peace in the midst of their chaotic flight, and Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as Jace brought the stallion to a halt beside the water. He dismounted first, then turned to help her down. For a moment, their eyes met as his hands encircled her waist, and Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with their desperate circumstances. There was something about this man, a quiet strength, a gentle competence, that stood in stark contrast to his fearsome reputation. "Thank you," she said softly as her feet touched the ground, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Jace nodded and turned his attention to the horse, loosening the saddle cinch and allowing the great animal to drink from the spring. The stallion's sides were heaving from their hard ride, but its eyes remained alert and ready for whatever might come next. Clara looked down at herself and almost laughed at the absurdity of her appearance. Her wedding dress was dusty and torn, the elaborate skirts designed for graceful movement across polished floors now stained with sweat and desert grit. Her hair hung in disheveled waves around her shoulders, and she could feel gritty sand between her teeth. "I must look ridiculous," she said, attempting to smooth down the worst of the wrinkles in her dress. "You look like a woman who's just escaped from a trap," Jace replied, settling himself on a flat rock near the spring. "There's nothing ridiculous about that." The simple honesty of his words caught her off guard. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle splash of the spring and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon walls. It was Clara who finally broke the silence. "I need to see that journal again," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her hidden profession. "If what you've shown me is true, then Elias Ward isn't just a criminal. He's a traitor whose actions have cost innocent lives." Jace reached into his vest and withdrew the leather-bound book, handing it to her without hesitation. I've been gathering evidence against him for over a year, he said. Ever since I realized that the man the territorial government was paying me to hunt was actually innocent of the crimes Ward was committing. Clara's head snapped up. The territorial government was paying you? You're a bounty hunter? Was, Jace corrected. I gave up that life when I realized how often I was being used to cover up the crimes of men like Ward. Too many innocent people died because I believed the lies of corrupt officials. As Clara opened the journal and began to study its contents more carefully, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Page after page documented illegal arms sales, not just to Apache tribes but to anyone willing to pay Ward's prices. Mexican revolutionaries, outlaw gangs, even foreign agents seeking to destabilize the territory. All had apparently been customers of Elias Ward's shadow business. "Dear God," she whispered, her finger tracing a particular entry. "This shipment here, 200 rifles and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, this was right before the Apache raid on the Morrison Ranch. Those people died because of weapons Elias sold." "I tried to warn the territorial marshal," Jace said, his voice heavy with regret. "But Ward had already painted me as the guilty party. Every crime he committed was blamed on Jace Callahan, the dangerous outlaw who needed to be hunted down and eliminated." Clara looked up from the journal, studying his weathered face with new understanding. "So you've been living as a wanted man while the real criminal sat in his mansion, courting the mayor's daughter and building his reputation as a pillar of the community." "It was the perfect cover," Jace agreed. Who would suspect the prosperous rancher who was marrying into the town's most respectable family? Especially when there was a convenient scapegoat already being hunted by the territorial authorities. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Clara's own investigations as deputy sheriff had been consistently frustrated, always running into dead ends and mysterious obstacles. Now she realized that those obstacles had been deliberately placed in her path by the very man she had been about to marry. "He knew," she said suddenly, her green eyes widening with the realization. "Elias knew about my work as deputy sheriff. That's why he was so eager to marry me, not just for my father's political connections, but to neutralize the one law officer who might have been able to expose him." Jace nodded grimly. "I figured as much when I saw you draw that Colt. Ward's been keeping tabs on you for months, probably trying to figure out how much you suspected." Clara felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm air of the canyon. "If you hadn't interrupted that wedding, you would have been dead within a month," Jace finished. "Probably an accident, a fall from a horse, a tragic mishap with a firearm, some unfortunate encounter with outlaws. Ward couldn't risk having a trained law officer as a wife, not with what he had planned." The implications were staggering. Clara had been walking blindly toward her own execution, dressed in silk and lace and believing herself to be embracing a secure future. The man she had been about to promise to love and honor had been planning her murder from the moment he began his courtship. What did he have planned, she asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Jace was quiet for a long moment, his winter blue eyes fixed on the rippling surface of the spring. According to the records in that journal, Ward has been building towards something big, a major arms deal that would supply an entire Apache uprising with modern weapons. The territorial government has been pressuring the tribes to move to smaller reservations, and Ward sees an opportunity to profit from the inevitable conflict. By arming both sides, Clara said, the full horror of it becoming clear. He sells weapons to the Apache, then uses his political connections to ensure the cavalry is well armed for the response. He profits from the conflict and eliminates anyone who might expose him. including his own wife, if she became inconvenient, Jace confirmed. Clara closed the journal and sat back against the canyon wall, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had learned. Her entire life had been built on lies and deceptions. The father she respected was apparently either corrupt or willfully blind to Ward's activities. The man she had been about to marry was a monster who traded in death and suffering. Even her own secret identity as deputy sheriff had been known and manipulated by the very criminals she had been trying to catch. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why did you risk everything to save me? You could have just taken that evidence to the territorial marshal and let justice take its course." Jace was quiet for so long that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've seen too many innocent people die for other men's greed," he said. "And because," he paused, seeming to struggle with words, "because I've been watching you for months while I was gathering evidence against Ward. I saw how you conducted yourself as deputy sheriff, your dedication to justice, your willingness to stand up for what was right even when it put you in danger. You're not like the other people in Dusty Creek who are willing to look the other way as long as their own interests are protected." Clara felt her cheeks flush at the unexpected compliment. "You've been watching me?" "From a distance," Jace said quickly. "I needed to understand Ward's plans, and that meant keeping track of the people close to him. But what I saw was a woman who deserved better than to become another casualty in a corrupt man's schemes." Before Clara could respond, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Both of them froze, listening intently as the sound grew closer. Multiple horses riding hard and fast, a pursuit party, just as Jace had predicted. "How many?" Clara asked, her hand instinctively moving toward the colt hidden beneath her dress. Jace was already moving toward his stallion, tightening the saddle cinch with practiced efficiency. "At least 6, maybe more. Ward doesn't take chances when it comes to protecting his interests." Clara gathered the dusty folds of her wedding dress and prepared to mount the horse once again. As she did, she made a decision that would change the course of her life forever. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice steady and determined, "I believe you. And as a deputy sheriff of this territory, I'm placing Elias Ward under arrest for treason, conspiracy, and murder. Will you help me bring him to justice?" Jace paused in his preparations, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "Yes, ma'am. Deputy, it would be my honor." The sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Clara felt a sense of purpose and determination that had nothing to do with duty or expectation. She was no longer running from her problems. She was riding toward a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the safety of countless innocent people across the territory. "Then let's ride," she said, swinging up behind Jace on the powerful stallion. "We have a criminal to catch." They rode deeper into the maze of canyons, the stallion's hooves finding purchase on rocky ledges that would have challenged a mountain goat. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit echoed off the stone walls, shouts of men and the clatter of iron shoes against rock as Ward's hired guns struggled to follow their trail. But Jace knew this country like a hawk knows the wind, guiding them through passages so narrow that Clara's wedding dress brushed against both walls simultaneously. As they climbed higher into the Badlands, the afternoon heat began to give way to the cooler air of elevation. The red sandstone formations around them had been carved by wind and water into fantastic shapes, towering spires, natural arches, and hidden alcoves that could shelter travelers from both the elements and unwanted attention. It was in one such alcove, barely visible from the canyon floor below, that Jace finally brought the stallion to a halt. "They'll never find us here," he said, helping Clara down from the horse. "This place has been a hideout for outlaws and renegades for 50 years. The rock formations create too many echoes for them to track us by sound." Clara looked around the hidden sanctuary with professional interest. The alcove was perhaps 30 feet deep and 20 wide, with a ceiling high enough to accommodate a man on horseback. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls, the work of tribes who had used this place for shelter long before white settlers arrived in the territory. A small seep in the back wall provided fresh water, and the remains of old campfires showed that many others had found refuge here over the years. "You seem to know quite a bit about outlaw hideouts," Clara observed, settling herself on a flat rock and finally beginning to work the pins from her disheveled hair. Jace unsaddled his horse and began rubbing the animal down with practiced efficiency. "A man learns where to find safety when he's been hunted across half the territory," he replied. "Though I prefer to think of myself as having been on the wrong side of a corrupt system rather than being a genuine outlaw." Clara studied his face in the golden light that filtered into the alcove. There was a weariness in his winter blue eyes that spoke of months, perhaps years, of living as a fugitive. Yet there was also an integrity there that she recognized, the same sense of justice that had driven her to become a deputy sheriff despite all the obstacles society placed in the path of a woman seeking such a role. "Tell me about the investigation that led you to Ward," she said, her voice taking on the professional tone she used when questioning witnesses. "How did you first discover his illegal activities?" Jace finished tending to his horse and came to sit across from her, the leather journal resting between them like a bridge between their two worlds. "It started with a bounty I was tracking, a man named Samuel Morton who was supposedly running guns to the Apache. The territorial marshal had a hefty reward posted for him, dead or alive." Clara nodded, encouraging him to continue. She had heard of Morton, a former cavalry sergeant who had disappeared from Fort Crawford along with a wagon full of military rifles. "I tracked Morton for 3 weeks," Jace continued, his voice growing distant with memory. "Finally cornered him in a cantina down in Nogales. But when I confronted him, he swore he was innocent, said he'd been framed by his commanding officer, who was skimming weapons from the fort's armory and needed a scapegoat." "Did you believe him?" Jace was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. "At first, no. I'd heard plenty of guilty men claim innocence when they were staring down the barrel of my gun. But Morton had something the others didn't. Proof. He'd kept records of every weapon that passed through the fort's armory, and the numbers didn't match what was officially reported." Clara felt a familiar tingle of excitement that came when pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. "What kind of proof?" "Shipping manifests, requisition forms, even photographs of serial numbers on rifles that were supposed to have been destroyed but were showing up in Apache raids." Jace reached for the journal and flipped to a section near the back. Morton had been investigating the thefts himself before he was framed. He'd traced the stolen weapons to a middleman who was selling them to various buyers throughout the territory. "Elias Ward," Clara said, though it wasn't really a question. Ward was the biggest customer, but not the only one. The operation was larger than I'd imagined, a network of corrupt officials, dishonest merchants, and ruthless opportunists all profiting from the chaos they were helping to create. Clara took the journal and studied the pages Jace had indicated. What she saw there made her blood run cold. Names she recognized from Dusty Creek's social circles, including several men she had considered pillars of the community. Dates and locations that corresponded to incidents she had investigated as deputy sheriff. Most damning of all, a detailed map showing weapon caches hidden throughout the territory, marked with symbols that indicated delivery dates and quantities. Dear God, she whispered, her finger tracing one particular location. This cache here, it's on the Williamson Ranch, the same ranch where 3 travelers were found murdered last month. Ward's been eliminating witnesses, Jace confirmed grimly. Anyone who might have seen too much, asked too many questions, or posed a threat to his operation. The Williamson family was killed because they discovered weapons hidden on their property. Clara's mind raced as she connected the dots between various cases she had investigated. The pattern had been there all along, but it had been obscured by the complexity of the conspiracy and her own limited perspective. As deputy sheriff, she had been investigating individual crimes without seeing the larger web of corruption that connected them all. There's something else, Jace said, his voice heavy with reluctance. Something about your father that you need to know. Clara looked up sharply, her green eyes narrowing with apprehension. What about my father? Jace flipped to another section of the journal, this one filled with what appeared to be financial records. Mayor Jennings has been receiving regular payments from Ward's organization. Not enough to make him rich, but enough to ensure his cooperation when certain matters came before the town council. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She stared at the neat columns of figures, seeing her father's name listed again and again alongside amounts that corresponded to dates when important votes had taken place in the town council. Roads that bypassed military checkpoints. Permits for businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. Zoning decisions that allowed Ward to build warehouses in strategic locations. He knows, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. My father knows what Ward is doing, and he's been helping him. I don't think he understands the full scope of it, Jace said gently. The payments are listed as consulting fees and civic improvement donations. Ward is very good at making his corruption look legitimate. But Clara was already shaking her head. No, you don't understand. My father isn't stupid, and he isn't naive. He's been in territorial politics for 15 years. He knows how to recognize a bribe, even when it's disguised as something else. The realization that her own father was complicit in Ward's crimes added another layer of betrayal to an already devastating day. Clara had always respected Mayor Jennings, even when she disagreed with his old-fashioned views about women's roles in society. To learn that he had been compromised by criminals was almost more than she could bear. There's more, Jace said reluctantly. Your marriage to Ward wasn't just about silencing you as deputy sheriff. It was also about legitimizing Ward's position in the community and giving him access to territorial political connections through your father. Clara closed the journal and set it aside, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the conspiracy she had uncovered. Her entire life had been built on lies and deceptions. The father she had looked up to was corrupt. The man she had been about to marry was a murderer. Even her secret career as a law officer had been known and manipulated by the very criminals she had been trying to catch. How long have you been watching me? She asked suddenly. Jace looked uncomfortable. About 6 months. Once I realized Ward was planning to marry you, I needed to understand whether you were part of his organization or an innocent victim. And what did you conclude? That you were the only honest law officer in Dusty Creek. Jace replied without hesitation. Every investigation you conducted was thorough and professional. You followed evidence wherever it led, even when it made powerful people uncomfortable. That's why Ward needed to neutralize you. You were getting too close to the truth. Clara thought back over the past 6 months, remembering the various cases she had worked on and the frustrations she had encountered. Time and again, she had been told to drop investigations or focus on other priorities. Witnesses had disappeared or changed their stories. Evidence had gone missing from the sheriff's office. She had attributed these problems to incompetence or bad luck, never suspecting deliberate sabotage. "The Morrison Ranch massacre," she said suddenly. "I wanted to investigate the source of the weapons used in that attack. But Sheriff Morrison told me it wasn't our jurisdiction. He said the territorial marshal was handling it." "The territorial marshal was never notified," Jace confirmed. "Morrison was ordered to keep you away from that investigation because it would have led you straight to Ward's weapons cache." Clara felt anger rising in her chest, not just at Ward and her father, but at herself for being so blind to what was happening around her. She had prided herself on being a good detective, but she had missed a conspiracy that was operating right under her nose. "I should have seen it," she said, her hands clenching into fists. "All the signs were there. I should have put it together." "You couldn't have," Jace said firmly. "Ward was very careful to compartmentalize his operation. No one person except him had access to all the information. Even I didn't understand the full scope until I'd been investigating for over a year." From somewhere below them came the distant sound of horses and men's voices. Ward's pursuit party was still searching the canyons, though they seemed to be moving farther away rather than closer. Clara listened for a moment, then turned her attention back to the journal. "What's Ward's endgame?" she asked. "All of this. The weapons dealing, the corruption, the murders. What's he ultimately trying to accomplish?" Jace leaned forward, his expression grave. "According to the records I've seen, Ward is planning something he calls the final solution to the Indian problem. He's been selling weapons to Apache leaders while simultaneously providing intelligence to cavalry units about tribal movements. He's trying to provoke a full-scale war that will result in the complete elimination of the Apache as an obstacle to territorial development." Clara felt her stomach turn. "Genocide," she whispered. "He's planning genocide, and profiting from both sides of the conflict." "Exactly. And once the Apache are eliminated, Ward will control vast tracts of land that can be sold to railroad companies and mining interests. He's positioned himself to become one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the territory." The scope of Ward's ambition was breathtaking in its cruelty. Clara had always known he was ambitious, but she had never imagined he was capable of orchestrating mass murder for financial gain. The man she had been about to marry was not just a criminal. He was a monster whose schemes would result in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever it takes, we have to expose this conspiracy and bring Ward to justice." Jace nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "It won't be easy. Ward has allies throughout the territorial government, and most of the honest officials are too far away to help us quickly. We're essentially on our own." Clara stood up and began pacing the small confines of the alcove, her mind working through the possibilities. As deputy sheriff, she had authority to make arrests, but only within her jurisdiction. Ward's operation extended far beyond the boundaries of Dusty Creek, and she would need help from territorial authorities to bring down the entire conspiracy. "There's someone we can trust," she said suddenly. "Judge Harrison in Riverton. He's known for his integrity, and he has the authority to issue territorial warrants. Riverton is 3 days' ride from here," Jace pointed out. "Ward will have time to cover his tracks, eliminate evidence, maybe even flee the territory. Then we'll have to make sure he doesn't," Clara replied, her green eyes bright with determination. "We have his journal, his records, his own words documenting his crimes. That should be enough to convince Judge Harrison to act quickly." As the sun began to set outside their rocky sanctuary, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, Clara felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with duty or family expectations. For the first time in her life, she was free to be exactly who she wanted to be. A law officer dedicated to justice, a woman capable of making her own choices, and a person willing to risk everything to protect the innocent. The sound of pursuit had faded into the distance, but Clara knew their respite was temporary. Ward would not give up easily, and the next phase of their journey would be even more dangerous than their desperate flight from Dusty Creek. But she was no longer the sheltered mayor's daughter who had stood at that altar in her wedding dress. She was Deputy Sheriff Clara Jennings, and she had work to do. Dawn was still 2 hours away when the sound of approaching riders jolted Clara and Jace from their uneasy rest. The stallion's ears pricked forward, and a low whinny of warning echoed softly through the alcove. Both Clara and Jace were instantly alert, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons as they strained to listen in the pre-dawn darkness. "How many?" Clara whispered, her fingers closing around the grip of her Colt. Jace held up his hand for silence, his head tilted as he counted the rhythm of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. "4 riders," he murmured. "Maybe 5. They're moving slow, trying to track us in the dark." The sound grew closer, and Clara could hear the soft scrape of iron shoes against stone as the horses picked their way carefully along the narrow canyon floor. Whoever was hunting them had waited for the coolest part of the night to resume their search, when both men and animals could move more efficiently through the punishing landscape. "They've found our trail," Jace said grimly, checking the loads in his twin Colts. "Ward must have brought in a professional tracker." Clara's mind raced through their options. The alcove that had provided such perfect concealment during daylight now felt like a trap. There was only one way in or out, and if their pursuers discovered the narrow path that led up to their hiding place, they would be cornered with no means of escape. "Can we get past them?" she asked, gathering the torn remnants of her wedding dress and preparing to move. "Not without a fight," Jace replied. "The path down is too narrow for speed, and they'll hear us coming long before we reach the canyon floor." The voices of the search party drifted up from below, low and cautious but clearly audible in the crisp desert air. Clara recognized one of them, Frank Hutchins, Ward's foreman and chief enforcer. She had encountered him several times in her capacity as deputy sheriff, always in connection with incidents that seemed to dance just on the edge of legality. "Tracks lead up this way," Hutchins was saying. "Fresh horse droppings, maybe 6 hours old." "You sure about this, Frank?" another voice replied. "That path looks mighty treacherous in the dark." "Ward wants them found," Hutchins said flatly. "Dead or alive, makes no difference to him. That woman knows too much, and Callahan's got evidence that could ruin everything." Clara felt a chill run down her spine at the casual way Hutchins discussed their potential murder. These weren't lawmen pursuing criminals. They were assassins sent to eliminate witnesses. The realization crystallized her understanding of just how far Ward was willing to go to protect his conspiracy. Jace had moved to the mouth of the alcove and was studying the narrow path that led down to the canyon floor. "There's another way," he said quietly. "A ledge that runs along the canyon wall about 50 feet above the floor. It's dangerous, especially in the dark, but it might get us past them." Clara joined him at the edge of their sanctuary and looked down at the path he indicated. In the pale starlight, she could barely make out a narrow shelf of stone that curved around the canyon wall like a natural balcony. It was perhaps 18 inches wide at its broadest point, with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet on one side and smooth rock face on the other. "That's not a path," she said. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Jace acknowledged, "but it's better odds than facing 4 armed men in a confined space." The sound of boots on stone was growing closer as the search party began to climb the path toward their hiding place. Clara could hear them moving carefully but steadily upward, their progress marked by the occasional rattle of loose pebbles and muffled curses when someone slipped. "We don't have much time," Jace said, already moving toward his horse. "If we're going to try the ledge, we need to go now." Clara looked once more at the terrifying narrow shelf of stone, then at the path where their enemies were approaching. The choice was between certain death and probable death, not much of a choice at all. But she had not come this far to surrender without a fight. "The horse can't make it across that ledge," she pointed out. Jace's face was grim in the starlight. "I know. We'll have to leave him and continue on foot." The stallion had been Jace's companion through months of being hunted across the territory. Clara could see the pain in his eyes at the thought of abandoning the loyal animal. But there was no alternative. He quickly removed the saddle and bridle, then gave the horse a gentle slap on the rump to send it deeper into the alcove where it might avoid the worst of any gunfire. "Come on," he said, extending his hand to Clara. "Stay close to the wall and don't look down." They crept to the edge of the alcove where the ledge began, a narrow ribbon of stone that disappeared into shadow around the curve of the canyon wall. Jace went first, pressing his back against the rock face and sliding his feet carefully along the treacherous path. Clara followed, her heart hammering as she felt the emptiness yawning beneath her feet. The first few steps were the worst. Her elaborate wedding dress, already torn and dusty from their escape, caught on every projection of rock and threatened to throw her off balance. She gathered the cumbersome fabric as best she could, but the full skirts were never designed for this kind of desperate maneuvering. "Steady," Jace whispered, reaching back to steady her when she swayed dangerously. Just one step at a time. They had made it perhaps 30 feet along the ledge when the sound of gunfire erupted from their former hiding place. Hutchins and his men had discovered the empty alcove and were now searching frantically for any sign of their quarry. Shouts echoed off the canyon walls as they realized their prey had somehow escaped. "They went up," someone yelled. "Check the rim." "No tracks," Hutchins replied, his voice sharp with frustration. "They couldn't have just vanished." Clara pressed herself against the cold stone of the canyon wall, hardly daring to breathe as the search party milled around below them. From her position on the ledge, she could see the glow of their torches as they examined every possible escape route. If any of them thought to look up at just the right angle, the game would be over. "There!" The shout came from directly below them, and Clara's blood turned to ice. On the ledge, gunfire erupted from the canyon floor, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Bullets sparked off the rock face around them, sending chips of stone flying. Clara felt one fragment nick her cheek, drawing a thin line of blood. "Move!" Jace shouted, abandoning stealth for speed as he pushed Clara ahead of him along the treacherous ledge. They scrambled along the narrow path as fast as they dared, with bullets whistling around them and the abyss yawning beneath their feet. Clara's dress finally proved too cumbersome, and she heard fabric tear as she pulled herself around a particularly difficult section where the ledge narrowed to barely a foot in width. Behind them, Hutchins was shouting orders to his men. "Get around to the other side. Cut them off before they reach the end of the ledge." Clara realized that their desperate escape was turning into a trap. The ledge curved around the canyon wall for perhaps 200 yards before ending at another narrow cleft in the rock. If Hutchins could get his men positioned at both ends, she and Jace would be caught in the middle with nowhere to go. "There's a cave opening ahead," Jace called back to her. "About 50 yards, if we can reach it." His words were cut off by the sharp crack of a rifle from the canyon rim above them. Someone had climbed up to get a better angle. and now bullets were raining down from overhead as well as from below. Clara felt her foot slip on loose gravel, and for a terrifying moment she teetered on the edge of the abyss before Jace's strong hand caught her arm and pulled her back against the wall. "Thank you," she gasped, her heart racing from the near fall. "Save the thanks until we're out of this," he replied grimly. They pressed on, moving as quickly as the treacherous footing would allow. Clara could see the dark opening Jace had mentioned, a horizontal crack in the canyon wall that looked barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It wasn't much, but it was better than being exposed on the ledge like targets in a shooting gallery. More gunfire erupted from multiple directions as Ward's men coordinated their attack. Clara heard Jace grunt and saw him stumble slightly as a bullet creased his left shoulder, leaving a dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You're hit," she said, reaching out to steady him. "It's nothing," he replied through gritted teeth. "Keep moving." They reached the cave opening just as the gunfire intensified. Jace pushed Clara toward the narrow entrance, then turned to provide covering fire with his twin Colts. The revolvers bucked in his hands as he sent measured shots toward the muzzle flashes below, forcing the attackers to seek cover and buying precious seconds. Clara squeezed through the cave opening, feeling rough stone scrape against her arms and shoulders. The passage was barely wide enough for her body, and she had to turn sideways and push with her feet to make progress. Behind her, she could hear Jace's guns continuing to bark as he held off their pursuers. "Come on," she called when she had cleared the narrow entrance. "There's room." Jace fired his last shots and dove through the opening just as a volley of bullets struck the rock where he had been standing. For a moment, both of them lay gasping in the darkness of the cave, overwhelmed by their narrow escape. The cave extended back into the rock farther than Clara had expected, and as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could see that it opened into a larger chamber. More importantly, she could feel a faint current of air that suggested another exit somewhere deeper in the mountain. "We can't stay here long," Jace said, reloading his weapons by feel. "They'll figure out where we went and come after us." Clara felt around in the darkness until she found his wounded shoulder. The bullet had torn through the fabric of his shirt and left a bloody furrow in his flesh, but it didn't seem to have hit anything vital. "Let me look at that," she said, tearing a strip of fabric from her already ruined wedding dress to use as a bandage. "I said it's nothing," Jace protested, but he didn't pull away as she cleaned the wound and tied the makeshift bandage in place. "It's not nothing," Clara replied firmly. "You've lost blood, and we still have a long way to go." As she worked, their proximity in the confined space made her acutely aware of his presence. In the darkness, she could hear his breathing, feel the warmth of his body, sense the quiet strength that had carried them both through the desperate escape. There was something about this man that drew her, not just gratitude for saving her life, but a deeper recognition of shared values and purpose. "Why did you really come for me?" she asked quietly as she finished tying the bandage. "The truth this time." Jace was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was soft in the darkness. "Because I've been alone for too long," he said. "Hunting the wrong men for the wrong reasons, living like an animal with a price on my head. When I saw you standing up to corruption and fighting for justice despite all the obstacles in your way, I remembered what it felt like to have something worth fighting for." Clara felt her breath catch at the unexpected honesty of his words. "And what is that?" "Hope," Jace replied simply. "Hope that there are still good people in this world worth protecting. Hope that justice isn't just a word politicians use to win votes. Hope that maybe, if we're very lucky and very careful, we might actually make a difference." From somewhere behind them came the sound of men entering the cave, their voices echoing off the stone walls as they began to search. Clara and Jace would have to move deeper into the mountain, following the air current toward whatever exit lay hidden in the darkness ahead. But for this moment, crouched together in the blackness with gunmen hunting them, and an uncertain future stretching ahead, Clara felt something she had never experienced before, the complete trust of another person who understood exactly who she was and what she stood for. "Then let's go make that difference," she whispered. And together they began to feel their way deeper into the mountain, following the promise of fresh air and freedom toward whatever dawn awaited them on the other side. The cave passage wound through the mountain for what felt like hours, though Clara suspected it was only the darkness and their desperate circumstances that made time seem to stretch endlessly. The narrow tunnel gradually widened as they followed the faint current of fresh air deeper into the rock, their hands trailing along the walls for guidance. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had faded to an occasional echo, suggesting that Ward's men were having difficulty navigating the cramped passage. When they finally emerged from the mountain's embrace, dawn was breaking over a landscape Clara didn't recognize. They stood on a rocky outcropping that overlooked a broad valley dotted with juniper trees and crossed by a meandering creek. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles away, she could see buildings clustered around what appeared to be a way station, one of the remote outposts that served travelers crossing the vast expanses between major settlements. "Nora's place," Jace said, following her gaze. "If anyone in this territory can help us, it's her." Clara studied the distant buildings with the practiced eye of a law officer. The main structure was a low adobe building with a wide porch and several smaller outbuildings arranged around a central courtyard. Smoke rose from the chimney, and she could see horses in a corral behind the main house. It looked peaceful enough, but appearances could be deceiving in this lawless country. "Who is she?" Clara asked as they began picking their way down the rocky slope toward the valley floor. "Nora McKenna used to be the territorial marshal for this district," Jace explained, his wounded shoulder making him move more carefully than usual. "Served for 15 years before she got tired of fighting corruption in the territorial government. Now she runs a way station for travelers and keeps her own kind of peace in this part of the country." Clara felt a spark of interest. A female law officer. She had never met another woman who had managed to break through the barriers that kept their gender from such positions. She was actually appointed as a territorial marshal? "Inherited the position when her husband was killed by outlaws," Jace said. "The territorial governor was going to replace her with someone else, but she'd already cleaned up 3 outlaw gangs and brought order to a district that had been considered ungovernable. Results have a way of overcoming prejudice, at least sometimes." As they approached the way station, Clara could see that her first impression had been too benign. The buildings were indeed peaceful, but they were also clearly fortified. The windows had heavy shutters that could be closed against attack. The doors were reinforced with iron strappings, and she noticed rifle ports cunningly concealed in the adobe walls. This was a place prepared for trouble. A woman emerged from the main building as they walked into the courtyard, and Clara immediately understood why Nora McKenna had been successful as a territorial marshal. She was perhaps 50 years old, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore men's clothing, denim trousers, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest, and a well-used Colt revolver hung at her hip with the casual ease of long familiarity. "Jace Callahan," Nora said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I heard Ward's boys were hunting you with blood in their eyes. Figured you might turn up here eventually." "Hello, Nora," Jace replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I hope you don't mind us dropping in unannounced." Nora's keen gaze shifted to Clara, taking in the torn and dusty wedding dress, the determined set of her jaw, and the way she carried herself despite her disheveled appearance. "And you must be the mayor's daughter who caused such a stir in Dusty Creek yesterday. The whole territory's buzzing with stories about the bride who pulled a gun on her own wedding and rode off with the most wanted man in 3 counties. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Clara Jennings," she said, deciding that honesty was the best approach with someone who had clearly already heard at least part of their story. Nora's eyebrows rose slightly. "Deputy Sheriff? Well, that explains a few things." She looked Clara up and down with new respect. "Come inside, both of you. You look like you could use some food and coffee, and I imagine you have quite a story to tell." The interior of the way station was comfortable but practical, with thick adobe walls that kept the desert heat at bay. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a massive stone fireplace at one end and a long wooden table surrounded by chairs. The walls were decorated with maps of the territory, wanted posters, and what appeared to be commendations from various law enforcement agencies. Nora bustled around the kitchen area, preparing coffee and setting out plates of bread and cold meat. As she worked, she kept up a steady stream of conversation that Clara realized was actually a careful interrogation. "So Ward's been running guns to the Apache," Nora said matter-of-factly as she poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. "Can't say I'm surprised. I always figured he was dirty, but I never had enough evidence to prove it." Jace pulled out the leather journal and placed it on the table. "We've got evidence now. More than enough to hang him and most of his organization." Nora sat down across from them and opened the journal, her expression growing increasingly grim as she studied its contents. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," she muttered. "This is worse than I thought. He's not just selling guns, he's orchestrating a full-scale war." "You've heard rumors?" Clara asked. "More than rumors," Nora replied. "I've been tracking unusual movement patterns among the Apache bands for months. Scouts reporting larger than normal gatherings, increased raiding activity, talk of a great leader who would unite all the tribes against the white settlements. I thought it was just the usual tensions over the reservation boundaries. Ward's been providing them with the weapons and intelligence they need to make such an uprising possible," Jace explained. "At the same time, he's feeding information to cavalry units about Apache movements, ensuring maximum casualties on both sides." Nora closed the journal and sat back in her chair, her expression troubled. "The bastard's playing both ends against the middle. The more violence there is, the more the territorial government will pay for weapons and the more valuable his landholdings become when the Apache are finally defeated." Clara felt sick as the full implications became clear. "How many people will die if he succeeds?" "Thousands," Nora said bluntly. "Maybe tens of thousands. The Apache are proud warriors, and if they believe they have a real chance of driving out the white settlers, they'll fight to the last man. Meanwhile, the territorial government will call in the regular army, and this whole region will become a slaughterhouse." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, each contemplating the magnitude of what they were facing. Finally, Nora spoke again. "What's your plan?" "Get this evidence to Judge Harrison in Riverton," Clara said. "He has the authority to issue territorial warrants and call for federal intervention if necessary." Nora nodded approvingly. "Harrison's honest, and he's got the backbone to act on evidence like this. But Riverton's 3 days' ride from here, and Ward's not going to give up easily. He's got too much at stake." "We know," Jace said. "That's why we need help." Nora stood up and walked to one of the windows, peering out at the desert landscape. "Ward's already put out word that you're dangerous criminals who've kidnapped the mayor's daughter. He's offering $1,000 reward for your capture, dead or alive. Clara felt her stomach drop. $1,000 was more money than most people in the territory saw in 5 years. With that kind of bounty on their heads, every drifter and would-be gunfighter between here and Riverton would be hunting them. There's more, Nora continued. I got word this morning that Ward sent his best men ahead to Riverton. They're posing as territorial marshals with orders to arrest you on sight. Even if you reach Judge Harrison, you might not live long enough to present your evidence. The situation seemed hopeless. Ward had the resources to field a small army, the political connections to make their testimony seem like the ravings of desperate criminals, and the ruthless determination to eliminate anyone who threatened his plans. Clara and Jace were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of places to hide. So what do you suggest? Clara asked. Nora turned back to face them, and Clara saw something in the older woman's expression that reminded her of her own determination to see justice done. I suggest we even the odds a little. She walked to a large cabinet in the corner of the room and opened it to reveal an impressive arsenal of weapons. Rifles, shotguns, revolvers, and boxes of ammunition were neatly arranged on wooden shelves. But it was what Nora pulled from the top shelf that made Clara's eyes widen. A badge bearing the seal of the Territorial Marshal's office. I may have retired from active duty, Nora said, pinning the badge to her vest. But I never officially resigned my commission. As far as the territorial government is concerned, I'm still Marshal McKenna, and I have the authority to deputize civilians in emergency situations. She reached into the cabinet again and withdrew 2 more badges, which she placed on the table in front of Clara and Jace. Consider yourselves officially deputized as territorial marshals. Now we have the legal authority to pursue Ward and his organization across territorial boundaries. Clara picked up one of the badges, feeling its weight in her palm. It was more than just a piece of metal. It was official recognition of what she had always known herself to be, a law officer dedicated to protecting the innocent and bringing criminals to justice. What about horses? Jace asked practically. We can't make it to Riverton on foot, and Ward's men will be watching every way station and trading post between here and there. Nora smiled grimly. I've got 3 of the finest horses in the territory in my corral. They're fast, they're tough, and they can go all day without water if they have to. More importantly, I know every hidden trail, every waterhole, and every safe place to rest between here and Riverton. Clara looked up sharply. You're coming with us? Damn right I am, Nora said firmly. I've been fighting corruption in this territory for 20 years. And I'm not about to let a snake like Ward destroy everything I've worked for. Besides, you'll need someone who knows the country and has the authority to deal with any local law officers who might try to interfere. Clara felt a surge of hope for the first time since their desperate flight from Dusty Creek. With Nora's help, they might actually have a chance of reaching Riverton alive and presenting their evidence to Judge Harrison. More than that, they would be traveling as legitimate law officers rather than fugitives, which would make all the difference if they encountered other territorial authorities along the way. There's something else, Nora said, her expression growing serious again. Ward's not just a local problem anymore. I've been getting reports of similar activities in other parts of the territory. Weapons smuggling, political corruption, mysterious murders of honest officials. I think Ward's organization is part of something much larger. A territorial conspiracy? Clara asked. Maybe even bigger than that, Nora replied. There are powerful interests back east who would benefit greatly from a prolonged Indian war in this region. Railroad companies who want to build through tribal lands, mining corporations who want access to mineral rights. Politicians who want to justify larger military appropriations? Ward might just be one tentacle of a much larger beast. The implications were staggering, if Nora was right. Their mission to expose Ward's crimes was just the beginning of a much larger fight against corruption that extended all the way to the territorial capital and possibly beyond. "All the more reason to stop him now," Clara said, pinning the marshal's badge to what remained of her wedding dress. "Before his plans can reach fruition." Nora nodded approvingly. "Spoken like a true law officer. Now, let's get you both properly equipped and mounted. We've got a long ride ahead of us, and Ward's people won't be far behind." As they prepared for the next phase of their journey, Clara felt a sense of purpose and determination that had nothing to do with duty or family expectations. She was no longer the sheltered mayor's daughter, or even the secret deputy sheriff of a small frontier town. She was a territorial marshal with the authority and responsibility to protect innocent lives across the entire region. The sun was climbing higher in the desert sky, promising another day of punishing heat. But Clara no longer felt like a fugitive running from her problems. She was a law officer pursuing justice, and with allies like Jace and Nora at her side, she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead on the road to Riverton. The town of Riverton shimmered in the midday heat like a mirage, its dusty streets and weathered buildings appearing to dance in the waves of superheated air rising from the desert floor. Clara. Jace and Nora had ridden hard for 2 days, following hidden trails and ancient waterholes that only someone with Nora's intimate knowledge of the territory could have navigated. Now, as they crested the final ridge overlooking their destination, the weight of their mission pressed down upon them like the merciless sun overhead. Riverton was larger than Dusty Creek, a proper territorial town with a courthouse, a bank, several hotels, and the kind of established businesses that came with railroad connections and steady commerce. The courthouse where Judge Harrison held court stood at the center of the main square, its whitewashed walls and red tile roof giving it an air of authority and permanence that smaller frontier settlements lacked. "There," Nora said, pointing toward the imposing building. "If Harrison's in session, we can present our evidence within the hour." But even as she spoke, Clara noticed something that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Too many horses were tied at the hitching posts around the square, far more than a town this size should have on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. More troubling still. She recognized several of the animals as belonging to Ward's organization, their distinctive brands clearly visible even at this distance. "We're expected," Jace said grimly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun belt. "Ward's people are already here." Nora pulled out a small telescope and studied the scene below them. "I count at least 8 horses that don't belong to locals," she reported. "Could be more hidden in the side streets. They're trying to look casual, but there are too many men lounging around the square for this to be anything but an ambush." Clara felt her pulse quicken as she realized the full scope of the trap waiting for them. Ward had anticipated their destination and moved his pieces into position ahead of them. The very place where they had hoped to find justice might instead become the site of their final confrontation. "We could circle around," Jace suggested. "Try to reach the courthouse from the back." "No good," Nora replied, still studying the town through her telescope. "They've got men positioned at all the approaches. Besides, even if we could reach Harrison, what's to stop them from claiming we're dangerous criminals who forced our way into his chambers? Without witnesses to our testimony, Ward's people could spin any story they wanted." Clara studied the layout of the town, her tactical training as a deputy sheriff automatically cataloging the strengths and weaknesses of their position. The main square was completely open, offering no cover for anyone caught in the middle. The courthouse sat at the far end, with its main entrance facing the square directly. Side streets branched off at regular intervals, providing multiple escape routes for anyone positioned around the perimeter. "What if we don't try to avoid the confrontation?" she said suddenly. "What if we force it out into the open where everyone can see what's really happening?" Both Jace and Nora looked at her with surprise. "You want to walk into an ambush?" Jace asked. "I want to make it impossible for Ward's people to claim we're the criminals," Clara replied, her mind working through the possibilities. "If we ride into that square openly, wearing our marshal's badges and calling for Judge Harrison to witness our testimony, everyone in town will see exactly who we are and what we're trying to do." Nora nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her weathered features. Public testimony. Force Ward's men to show their true colors in front of the whole town. "It's risky," Jace pointed out. "If shooting starts in that square, innocent people could get hurt. And if we don't stop Ward's conspiracy, thousands of innocent people will die in the war he's trying to provoke," Clara countered. "Sometimes the only way to prevent a greater evil is to accept a smaller risk." The three of them sat their horses in silence for a moment, each contemplating the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The sun had reached its zenith, turning the desert air into a furnace that made even breathing an effort. In the distance, the town of Riverton waited like a chessboard where the final moves of a deadly game were about to be played. "All right," Nora said finally. "We do this together, and we do it right. Badges visible, weapons ready but not drawn. We ride straight to the courthouse steps and call for Judge Harrison to come out and hear our testimony." Clara checked her Colt one final time, ensuring that all 6 chambers were loaded and that the weapon would slide smoothly from its holster when needed. The familiar weight of the gun at her hip was reassuring, but she knew that their success would depend more on courage and determination than on marksmanship. "Remember," Jace said as they prepared to descend toward the town, "our goal is to present the evidence, not to start a war. But if Ward's people force the issue, then we end it," Clara finished, her green eyes hard with resolve. They rode down the slope at a steady pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, their marshal's badges glinting in the harsh sunlight. As they approached the outskirts of Riverton, Clara could see people beginning to gather at windows and doorways, drawn by the sight of 3 armed riders approaching the town center. Word would spread quickly. It always did in settlements this size, and within minutes everyone in Riverton would know that something significant was about to happen. The main street stretched before them like a gauntlet, lined with false-fronted buildings that cast precious little shade in the midday sun. Clara could see men positioned at strategic points along the street, lounging on porches, standing in doorways, sitting on benches outside the general store. To a casual observer, they might have appeared to be ordinary townspeople going about their daily business. But Clara's trained eye noted the telltale signs, the way they watched the approaching riders, the bulges under their jackets that suggested concealed weapons, the coordinated positioning that spoke of military planning. As they entered the main square, Clara heard Nora call out in a voice that carried clearly across the open space. "Judge Harrison, this is Marshal McKenna of the Territorial Service. I have urgent business that requires your immediate attention." The courthouse doors remained closed, but Clara could see movement behind the windows. More significantly, she noticed that the men positioned around the square had begun to shift their positions, moving subtly to surround the 3 riders while maintaining the pretense of casual activity. "Judge Harrison!" Nora called again, her voice even louder. "I have evidence of treason and conspiracy that threatens the security of this territory." This time, the courthouse doors opened, and a portly man in judicial robes emerged onto the front steps. Judge Harrison was perhaps 60 years old, with thinning gray hair and the soft appearance of someone who had spent his life behind a desk rather than in the saddle. But his eyes were sharp and alert as he studied the three riders in the center of his town square. "Marshal McKenna," he called back, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "I was told you had retired from active service. I've been recalled to duty by the severity of the crimes we've uncovered." Nora replied, pulling the leather journal from her saddlebag and holding it up for all to see. "This contains documentary evidence of a conspiracy to arm hostile tribes and provoke a territorial war for personal profit." A murmur ran through the crowd that had gathered to watch the proceedings. Clara could see more people emerging from buildings around the square, drawn by the drama unfolding before them. Shopkeepers, their wives and children, cowboys, and townspeople of every description were creating an audience that would make it impossible for Ward's men to act without witnesses. "That's a serious accusation," Judge Harrison said, beginning to descend the courthouse steps. "Who do you accuse of these crimes?" "Elias Ward of Dusty Creek, Mayor Thomas Jennings, and a network of corrupt officials throughout the territory," Clara called out, her voice ringing with authority despite her youth. "I am Deputy Sheriff Clara Jennings, and I have personally witnessed evidence of their criminal activities." The name Jennings sent another ripple through the crowd. Clara could see people pointing and whispering as they realized they were witnessing a daughter accusing her own father of corruption. The human drama of the situation was ensuring that every person in Riverton would remember this moment and be able to testify to what they had seen and heard. It was then that the trap was finally sprung. "That's far enough!" The shout came from a man who stepped out from behind the general store, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Clara recognized him as one of Ward's hired guns, a professional killer named Seth Morrison who had terrorized 3 counties before Ward had recruited him. "Those people are wanted criminals, and I'm placing them under arrest." More men emerged from their concealment around the square, all wearing the badges of territorial marshals but carrying themselves with the swagger of hired killers rather than legitimate lawmen. Clara counted at least 8 of them, positioned to create a crossfire that would cut down anyone caught in the center of the square. "Show me your warrants," Judge Harrison demanded, his judicial instincts overriding any fear he might have felt. "By what authority do you claim jurisdiction in my court?" "By the authority of the territorial government," Morrison replied, producing a folded document from his jacket. "These 3 are wanted for kidnapping, assault, and treason against the territorial authority." Clara felt her heart sink as she realized how thoroughly Ward had prepared for this moment. The forged warrants would appear legitimate to anyone who didn't know the truth. And Morrison's men could claim they were simply doing their duty as law officers, unless she and her companions could present their evidence before the shooting started. They would be dismissed as criminals trying to escape justice. "Judge Harrison," Clara called out, her voice carrying across the tense silence that had fallen over the square. "I request the right to present evidence before you rule on the validity of those warrants. As a deputy sheriff of this territory, I have the right to be heard before any arrest is made." Harrison nodded, his legal mind grasping the importance of proper procedure even in such extraordinary circumstances. "The request is granted. Approach the courthouse and present your evidence." But as Clara, Jace, and Nora began to move toward the courthouse steps, Morrison's hand tightened on his weapon. "No one moves," he barked. "These criminals are under arrest, and any attempt to resist will be met with force." The moment hung suspended like a drop of water on a thorn, trembling with potential energy that could explode into violence at the slightest provocation. Clara could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, knowing that her next decision would determine not only her own fate, but the lives of everyone in the square. You have no authority to prevent a citizen from presenting evidence to a judge, she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Stand aside and let justice take its course. Morrison's face twisted with ugly purpose. Justice is what I say it is, he snarled, and his hand began to move toward his gun. Clara's Colt was in her hand before Morrison had cleared leather, the weapon appearing with the lightning speed that came from years of practice and the desperate necessity of survival. The crack of her shot echoed off the buildings around the square like thunder, and Morrison spun around as the bullet took him in the shoulder, sending his own weapon flying into the dust. The square erupted into chaos as Morrison's men drew their guns and opened fire. But Clara was no longer the sheltered mayor's daughter who had stood at an altar in her wedding dress just 3 days before. She was a territorial marshal with a duty to protect innocent lives and bring criminals to justice. And she met the attack with the cold precision of a professional lawwoman. Her second shot dropped the gunman nearest to Judge Harrison, ensuring that the judge could reach the safety of the courthouse. Her third found its mark in the chest of a killer who was taking aim at Nora from behind a water trough. Around her, she could hear the distinctive reports of Jace's twin Colts and Nora's rifle as they fought to break the deadly crossfire that threatened to cut them down. Townspeople scattered for cover as bullets whined through the air. But Clara noticed that several of the local men had drawn their own weapons and were taking sides in the fight. The citizens of Riverton might not have known the details of the conspiracy, but they could see the difference between legitimate law officers and hired killers, and they were making their choice accordingly. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The desert sun turning the square into a furnace where men fought and died for their vision of justice. When the smoke finally cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded away, Clara found herself standing over Morrison's still form, her Colt trained on his chest as he clutched his wounded shoulder. "It's over," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Surrender, and you'll live to stand trial." Morrison's eyes were filled with hate and defeat, but he had the sense to nod his agreement. Around the square, the surviving members of Ward's force were being disarmed by townspeople and legitimate territorial officers who had emerged from hiding once the nature of the conflict became clear. Judge Harrison approached Clara with something like awe in his expression. "Marshal Jennings," he said, using her new title with evident respect. "I believe you have evidence to present to this court." Clara holstered her weapon and reached for the leather journal that contained the proof of Ward's conspiracy. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, but she felt as though she was finally stepping into the light after years of living in shadow and deception. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "I have evidence that will change everything." The courtroom in Riverton had never seen such a gathering. Word of the dramatic shootout in the town square had spread across the territory like wildfire, drawing newspaper reporters, territorial officials, and curious citizens from hundreds of miles away. Judge Harrison had cleared his docket for an emergency session that would determine the fate of not just the conspirators, but the future of peace in the entire region. Clara sat at the prosecutor's table, no longer wearing the torn remnants of her wedding dress, but dressed in the practical clothing of a working law officer. Dark wool pants, a white cotton shirt, and a leather vest that bore her territorial marshal's badge. The transformation was more than just clothing. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had finally found her true calling. Beside her, Jace Callahan had been officially cleared of all charges and offered a position as a territorial marshal. The evidence in Ward's journal had proven beyond doubt that he had been framed for crimes committed by the very conspiracy he had been trying to expose. His winter blue eyes, once haunted by months of living as a hunted fugitive, now held the calm satisfaction of a man whose honor had been restored. At the defense table, Elias Ward sat in shackles, his carefully groomed appearance now disheveled and his gray eyes burning with impotent rage. The man who had once commanded respect as one of the territory's most successful ranchers was now revealed as a traitor whose schemes had cost countless innocent lives. Beside him, Mayor Thomas Jennings avoided his daughter's gaze, his face bearing the weight of shame and the knowledge that his corruption had nearly cost Clara her life. Judge Harrison had spent 3 days reviewing the evidence contained in Ward's journal, calling in handwriting experts and document analysts to verify its authenticity. The testimony of witnesses, including several of Ward's own former associates who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency, had painted a picture of corruption so extensive that it reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "The court finds the evidence overwhelming and conclusive," Judge Harrison declared, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Elias Ward, you are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead for the crimes of treason, conspiracy, and murder. Mayor Thomas Jennings, you are sentenced to 10 years in the territorial penitentiary for your role in this conspiracy." A murmur ran through the courtroom as the sentences were pronounced. Clara felt no satisfaction in seeing her father led away in chains, only a deep sadness for the choices that had brought them to this point. But she also felt a sense of closure, knowing that justice had finally been served for all those who had died because of Ward's greed. As the courtroom began to empty, Clara found herself approached by a distinguished gentleman in an expensive suit who had been observing the proceedings from the back of the room. He introduced himself as Colonel William Patterson, the territorial governor's special representative for law enforcement affairs. "Marshal Jennings," he said, offering his hand with obvious respect. "The territorial government would like to offer you the position of regional marshal for this district. Your actions in exposing this conspiracy have demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity and courage we need in our law enforcement officers." Clara looked out the courthouse window at the bustling street beyond, where normal life was resuming after the dramatic events of the past week. Children played in the dust, merchants hawked their wares, and settlers continued their daily struggle to build civilization in the wilderness. It was a good life, an honest life, and she had helped to preserve it. "I'm honored by the offer, Colonel," she replied, but I think my calling lies elsewhere." Patterson looked surprised. "Elsewhere? But surely you don't intend to return to Dusty Creek after everything that's happened?" Clara smiled, the expression transforming her face with a warmth that had been absent during the grim proceedings of the trial. "No, I don't think Dusty Creek would welcome me back, even if I wanted to return. But this territory is vast, and there are many places where honest law officers are needed." She turned to where Jace was speaking with Nora McKenna near the courthouse doors. The older woman had been offered her old position as territorial marshal, but she had declined, saying she preferred the independence of running her way station. However, she had agreed to serve as a special consultant to help clean up the corruption that Ward's conspiracy had revealed throughout the territorial government. "Marshal Callahan and I have discussed establishing a new kind of law enforcement service," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about plans that had been forming in her mind during the long days of testimony. "Something that can respond quickly to crimes that cross jurisdictional boundaries, that can pursue criminals across the entire territory without being limited by local politics or corruption." Colonel Patterson nodded thoughtfully. "A territorial ranger service. It's an interesting concept, and one that might have prevented this conspiracy from growing as large as it did. You would have the full backing of the territorial government?" "That's what we're hoping," Clara replied. "Too many criminals escape justice simply by crossing from one district to another. Too many local officials are subject to pressure or corruption because they're dependent on local political support. What we need is a force that answers only to territorial authority and has the freedom to pursue justice wherever it leads. As if summoned by their conversation, Jace approached the group, his hat in his hands and a slightly nervous expression on his weathered features. "Clara," he said, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" She excused herself from Colonel Patterson and followed Jace out onto the courthouse steps, where the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the town square. The place where they had fought for their lives just days before now seemed peaceful and ordinary, as if the violence had been nothing more than a bad dream. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Jace said, his winter blue eyes studying her face intently. "About the ranger service, about our partnership, about—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to a man more accustomed to action than speech. "About what?" Clara prompted gently. "About us," Jace said finally. "I know this isn't the time or place for such things, and I know you have important decisions to make about your future. But I need you to know that these past few days, fighting beside you, seeing your courage and your dedication to justice, it's made me realize that I don't want to face whatever comes next alone." Clara felt her heart skip a beat at the unexpected vulnerability in his voice. This was not the confident gunfighter who had burst into her wedding or the skilled tracker who had led them through the desert. This was simply a man who had found something precious and was afraid of losing it. "Jace," she said softly, "when you rode into that church and pulled me away from that altar, you gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. You gave me the freedom to be who I really am, not who everyone else expected me to be." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough texture of his beard beneath her fingers. "I was so focused on duty and family expectations that I forgot I had choices. You reminded me that I could choose my own path." "And what path do you choose?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara looked out at the vast expanse of desert and mountain that stretched beyond Riverton's boundaries, a land that was still wild and dangerous but full of possibilities for those brave enough to seize them. She thought about the criminals who escaped justice by fleeing to remote areas where no law could reach them, about the innocent people who suffered because corruption went unchecked, about the difference that two determined law officers could make if they were free to follow justice wherever it led. "I choose a path that includes you," she said, turning back to meet his gaze. "Partners in law enforcement, partners in life, partners in whatever adventures this territory has to offer." Jace's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, banishing the weariness and replacing it with something that looked very much like joy. "Are you proposing to me, Marshal Jennings?" Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the square like music. "I suppose I am. Is that a problem, Marshal Callahan?" "Not at all," he replied, pulling her into his arms. "Though I should warn you that my idea of a honeymoon involves tracking down the rest of Ward's associates who managed to escape territorial justice." "That sounds perfect," Clara said, standing on her toes to kiss him as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. 3 months later, Clara and Jace were married in a simple ceremony in the same courthouse where they had brought Ward to justice. Nora McKenna served as Clara's maid of honor, while Colonel Patterson stood as Jace's best man. The wedding dress was practical rather than elaborate, a simple blue dress that wouldn't interfere with the business of law enforcement, and Clara wore her marshal's badge pinned proudly to the bodice. Judge Harrison performed the ceremony, and as he pronounced them husband and wife, Clara reflected on how different this wedding was from the one that had been interrupted in Dusty Creek. There were no political alliances being cemented, no family expectations being fulfilled, no hidden agendas lurking beneath the surface. There was only love, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to justice that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As they emerged from the courthouse into the bright morning sunlight, Clara saw 2 horses waiting for them, wedding gifts from Nora, who understood that a honeymoon for 2 territorial marshals would necessarily involve travel to remote and dangerous places. The horses were loaded with supplies for the trail, and tucked into one of the saddlebags was a folder containing information about their first case together. A gang of cattle rustlers who had been terrorizing ranches along the territorial border. "Ready for our first official assignment as husband and wife?" Jace asked, helping Clara into her saddle. She settled herself comfortably, adjusting the weight of her gun belt and checking that her badge was securely pinned to her shirt. In the distance, the mountains beckoned with the promise of adventure and the certainty that somewhere out there, criminals were waiting to be brought to justice. "Ready?" she replied, touching her heels to her horse's flanks and riding out into the vast wilderness that was now truly her home. Behind them, the town of Riverton continued its daily business, secure in the knowledge that justice had prevailed and that somewhere in the territory, 2 dedicated law officers were working to keep honest people safe. And in the years that followed, the legend of Marshal Clara Callahan and her husband Jace would spread throughout the frontier, inspiring other women to take up the badge and proving that justice, like love, knew no boundaries when it was pursued by those brave enough to fight for what was right. The sun climbed higher in the clear desert sky as they rode toward their uncertain but promising future. 2 souls who had found in each other not just love, but the perfect partner for the work they were meant to do. The territory was vast, the challenges were many, but together they were ready for whatever lay ahead on the endless trail of justice that stretched before them.